to be featuring Geoff Swenson, who is an old friend and is our senior lecturer in international politics over in the UK, as we were just discussing just a moment ago. And just really in brief, Geoff is also an external affiliate here, of course. Current research focuses on issues related to post-conflict reconstruction, democracy, the rule of law, as you can tell, legal pluralism, international relations theory, foreign aid. In other words, the fun stuff. And today is going to be focusing on promoting the other rule of law. Really, really cool project, really neat paper. And Geoff, we're so thankful for you to be sharing it with us. I know this is just the beginning of your time as a visiting scholar here at the workshop. So hopefully it's going to be a nice kickoff and we'll start to make some of these connections and start some fun conversations. So without further ado, sir, over to you. And, per usual, I'll be moderating both online and here in the Tocqueville room from there.
Thank you so much, Scott. It is a genuine pleasure to be here. It's
long last, right?
Two years run up to be here, so it's been so long that I actually managed to get promoted by the time these slides. So a long time in academia time, but
that's right.
A genuine thrill to be here, and I'm super excited to get a chance to talk about the paper. So basically, what I want to talk about today is foreign aid to promote the rule of law, which is not focused on the state. And the vast majority of rule of law assistance historically, and for obvious reasons, focuses on the state courts, auxiliary institutions. However, this is not really the way justice is experienced in most of the places that actually receive foreign aid. So even though the rule of law is extraordinarily popular and has a lot of positive outcomes associated with it, for example, it correlates with positive development of mental outcomes. Scholars such as Roland Harris have argued that it's fundamental for successful post-conflict state building, things like this. The actual lived experience and the focus of most aid are fundamentally discontinuous. And so I wanted to actually explore, what does foreign policy that approaches non-state justice actually look like? Is there a foreign policy? What can we learn about it? So what is legal pluralism? As I'm sure all of you know, legal pluralism is basically when you have multiple justice systems with autonomy that coexist in the same space. And a common example of that would be Pashtunwali in Afghanistan or the Taliban's rival justice system in Afghanistan. So talking a little bit about legal pluralism. So legal pluralism exists everywhere, but only a limited number of high capacity states actually have non-state justice mechanisms firmly under control. So in the US, for example, we could sign an arbitration agreement which says, hey, we're not going to follow the law. And that is something that the law itself supports, and actually the power of the state is used to harness that. However, in a lot of other countries, you'll have full-fledged justice systems with meaningful autonomy that actually coexist alongside the state and maybe are even going to be clashing with the state. And we can see here that legal pluralism, and particularly non-state justice, is particularly vital in conflict and post-conflict settings, as they tend to be fluid and have weaker institutions and have higher levels of instability. However, as I've argued, legal pluralism in foreign aid is under-theorized and understudied, like everything, I'm sure. Anyway, so when we look at the key questions I want to look at in this paper, which is how have major rule of law donors conceptualized and approached non-state justice in their foreign policy? So specifically, what did I actually do? I looked at the 9 largest rule of law donors according to the OECD, and these 9 donors constitute over 95% of all aid that was given in the year 2016, which was the year that I started this research. And then I also in the paper looked at 5 specific case studies of large donors that actually tried to do something with regards to non-state justice. And I'll talk about why that matters in a second. But some people or some states, for example, Canada or Japan, no interest in doing anything with non-state justice whatsoever. They just proudly say, hey, we're statists. We only care about the state. Other states, such as Canada, for example, we recognize it's important, but there's no really workable policy approach. So I only focused on for the case studies on those states that actually tried to change systems. And what I did was I looked at published materials from state agencies from 2008 to 2018. That was every bit as exciting as it sounds. I read over 450 documents, most of them focused on aid policy or security strategies. And yeah, it was good times. I also emailed people at donor agencies and said, hey, am I missing anything? 3 of them got back to me, but I did try and make the effort. And I also supplemented this by secondary sources. So here, in case you're wondering, this was the level of funding for rule of law assistance in the year 2016. And these are the large donors that I looked at through a structured cross-country comparison. And as we can see, this is the amount for the largest donors, and this is the total amount. So even though there are going to be some states that I haven't looked at in detail, most of them are covered, and all of the big donors are covered. So what I did was in two parts. So first I want to talk a little bit about the theory, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the empirics. And I came up with a new typology to sort of help us better understand what foreign policy is actually doing with regards to non-state justice. And as we can see from this chart, states have lots of different options that they could pursue trying to achieve their policy goals. This can range from just simply saying, we recognize these non-state justice venues are important, and we want to work with them to help build the state, for example. Alternatively, or sometimes at the same time, states could be trying to change how the system works while also working with them. So a common refrain is, we like non-state justice for the fact that it can help us to bolster the state or help people get access to justice, but we really don't like its approach to women's rights, or the fact that it tends to have communal rather than individual policy goals. So as a result, we want to work with it, but we also want to change it. A little bit of a tension there. And third, and this may not even seem like a policy, but it's actually the single most common policy, is acknowledgement. We literally just say, hey, it's important, maybe we should do some research, but there was no actual attempt to do anything beyond that. So there's just guidance that says, hey, it's important. A couple states say denial, they don't even acknowledge it as a thing. And then in very extreme cases, you might actually find rejection where you're actually trying to destroy the non-state system. But for reasons I'll talk about at the end, those only tend to be in active conflict zones or other types of unstable places because of an obvious reason, right? If you have a really powerful entrenched system and you're trying to destroy them, they're probably not just going to be chill and take a step back. They're going to actually be a little bit upset when you try and sort of destroy them. And this could spark reciprocal violence. So what are they actually trying to achieve in policy? Well, I argued that there's 4 big policy goals. Judicial reform, so you're trying to actually make the justice system considered holistically function better. You could just be trying to recognize this from a donor perspective, saying, hey, we symbolically recognize these are important, but we're not going to get into the details. It could be used for counterinsurgency. You're trying to deal with a justice system which is threatening you. Or finally, you could be trying to work with them to bolster the state that you're sort of working with. So for example, by working with the Afghan state, you're trying to bolster it by getting the authority from the tribal institutions while also undercutting the Taliban's rival justice system. So that's the big picture typology, sort of in a theory building sense. And then I tried to test this empirically, or I tried to sort of see how this comports with what we can actually find empirically. And this is where sort of all things sort of shook out. And we could see of the 9 largest donors, 7 of them had some type of acknowledgement of non-state justice. But I can't stress enough, this was really, really thin for something that's important. So for example, New Zealand has one mention of it in 10 years of policy documents. Norway has 1 mention of it in 10 years of policy documents. The Netherlands will have had 4. So I mean, we're not talking about huge amounts of stuff for something that's really, really important. And what we could sort of see is that in general, states favor acknowledgement, particularly risk-adverse strategy. So this is sort of the first empirical argument that I'm sort of bringing in, which is this idea that basically risk aversion rather than policy outcomes is what's actually driving state behavior. Because we can see constant references to be concerned about the harms, making sure we're working with them, but protecting women's rights, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we can also see an empirical trend line, which I'll talk about at the end, but spoiler alert, states are getting less and less willing to engage with non-state justice, more and more risk averse. And by the end of the time in 2018, no state was doing anything like acceptance or repression. They were only doing either acknowledgement or acknowledgement and transformation. And transformation is risk averse because you can say, hey, we're working with you, but only if you 100% meet human rights standards. So for example, Germany says, we are proud to work with every non-state justice actor, provided that they are willingly and consensually going to work with us to be fully consistent with international human rights standards, which of course no non-state justice system is, and indeed no state is as an empirical matter, right? So you have a policy that's doing something else rather than actually trying to sort of achieve these goals. That's what my argument is. So what did I actually find? Well, first of all, I found that even though we're looking at non-state justice, state goals and mediating through state goals consistently framed all of the policies that I looked at, and that states tend to have really, really risk-adverse policy, and that they would favor risk aversion over policy coherence. This manifests in two ways. First of all, even if you thought you might be able to actually achieve something by pushing a policy, states were hesitant to do that. And second, they would oftentimes have multiple policies that were incoherent coexist at the same time. So you could be, for example, the US and Afghanistan was trying to work with the tribal systems as is to bolster their efforts on counterinsurgency. At the same time, they're trying to change those systems. Well, there's a little bit of a tension there, right? Because if you're changing something, how are you also using it as a pillar of stability? Doesn't make fully a lot of sense. And as I already mentioned, by 2018, no state was pursuing acceptance or rejection. And therefore, I argue that the key goal does not seem to be promoting rule of law or other goals, or at least are not willing to actually take the risks involved to do those goals. The third thing I've mentioned is the policy actually shows very little engagement with key stakeholders in the non-state justice system. So you still sort of have what I would call maybe like a positivist residue, where you sort of have this idea that basically the key thing is if we pass a law or we have a policy, all of a sudden people on the ground will change their behavior. But of course, anybody who's done anything in sort of the law and society or any type of policy change knows that it's not taken for granted that if you pass a new policy, it's actually going to change behavior. And what we saw was very, very little engagement with actual non-state justice stakeholders. Finally, we saw that there was no attempt to look at different types of legal pluralism. One of my sort of other big picture projects is trying to get us to think a little bit differently about legal pluralism and different types of legal pluralism and how those sort of policies might relate to one another. And what I found is that the non-state justice policies, to the extent they exist, would be the same in a war zone as they would be in a really highly stable country. And that doesn't really make a lot of sense from a policy perspective. So what we see is that you have very little policy, very superficial and uniform, independent of the policy environment. And furthermore, even though I didn't go into the empirics of here's every bit of, in Timor-Leste, we did this policy, or in this particular country did this policy, it's just too much for one particular paper. But what I did find was there was very little evidence cited in any of the policy documents that they were actually achieving anything, which is surprising because any of you who've ever worked with an international NGO donor or are familiar with the field, they love to talk about achievements and all the things that have been done. And so the fact that I'm pouring through 10 years of policy documentation and there's no successes cited, I think in and of itself, not conclusive, but certainly suggestive of something that there's not actually a ton of stuff going on there. And second, the favored policy actually runs counter to a lot of the empirical scholarship sort of from the law and society and sort of other areas, which sort of say that efforts to change systems don't tend to work and often tend to undermine that. And there is no engagement with the existing empirical work. And so then the final point is that there was high levels of policy inconsistency and incoherence, and there was never an attempt to reconcile this. So there was always a need for more research, always need for further inquiry, always need to have dialogue, but no attempt to ever actually reconcile this. So this was sort of my big picture, 15-minute overview of a lot of different things. But basically what I just sort of, the takeaway points were non-state justice, hugely important as an empirical matter for lived reality. However, from a policy perspective, not given a bunch of attention, not particularly well developed, and donors seem to be much more motivated by risk aversion rather than actually trying to achieve results. So thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
Well done, Jeff. Took that 15-minute mark seriously. There you go.
As I try and stay on time.
Yeah, very well. Yeah. No, I appreciate that. And sorry for like Macron-Putin dynamic here. I want to ask who's who in that. But this is fantastic. So yeah, maybe Bernie, I can get us started and we'll go around here.
Clarification, you use the word donor. And you're talking about these 5 countries. So you're really talking about the countries, the donor. You're not talking about a nonprofit disassociated from government. When you meant donor, you mean US State Department or something like that.
Yeah. So to clarify, so basically what I've done is I've looked at states and I've looked at what states have attempted to achieve through policy with a focus on foreign aid, but I've also, if they have a broad policy that's sort of like a military strategy, that would have been as well, didn't tend to happen. And so the way I'm sort of viewing this from the perspective of how the paper is structured, for example, IDLO is an implementer, but I would look at them in the context of, who's funding them or that type of stuff. So it's focused on states and state policy and sort of who they choose to hire to implement or not implement. It's not something I'm delving into.
Okay, yeah.
I'll be back with something else, but
I have no doubt, Bernie. I have no doubt. But yeah, Jess, please next, and then I think Brian after that. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Really interesting, and I have sort of so many questions. I'm going to try to, mostly because I find it.
We'll be here for a month.
I guess a few things that I would just start with that I'm interested in understanding more about have to do with, it seems like the strategies and ideas about risk that states are thinking about, particularly state agencies you're discussing, almost entirely conditional on their perception of the recipient state as a legitimate actor. And so that then leads to the question of, are these policy decisions and risk perceptions in any way independent from pre-existing balance of power arguments or pre-existing understandings of state capacity in the target state? And this then leads me to think about, okay, so especially if we're thinking about like transitional justice, right? Then we're really in this fuzzy space of, is the state a legitimate actor? If not, does that then allow these agencies a little bit more space to consider non-state judicial institutions, right? Is it clear what are and are not state-sponsored institutions, especially when we think about transitional justice, where like the narrative of conflict is so central, and it's whoever wrote that narrative tends to have the legitimacy, whether it's reflective of the lived experience or not. And then my final question is about this risk idea, because it seems like you have these two types of risk, which I think are super interesting. But it seems like, and you're sort of saying they're interested in mitigating risk instead of necessarily achieving these policy outcomes. But one of your risk types is essentially whether a policy is going to be successful or not, right? Programmatic risk is that. So it seems almost like they're more balancing between these two different kinds of risks instead of, right? Like they're worried that something's not going to work, which is one form of risk. And that may be related to or create trade-offs with the other form of risk, but that doesn't mean that. I guess I'm curious as to whether you feel like that means they're uninterested in the policy outcome, or if they're just worried about the policy outcome they've chosen not working. Sorry, there was a lot in there. I apologize.
I'm really sorry. I also don't have a working pen, so if I don't, if I miss any of your questions, please do tell me. One thing.
I'm not sure I could recall.
So
really.
Share the screen there, because I think there's some folks who wanted to see you. We'll see. Okay. Start to be. There we go.
Thanks a lot.
Not at all.
Great pen, by the way. So anyway, so basically thinking about,
Sorry, I guess you have to put start video. Start video.
Yes, that's what was going on. Okay, there we go. Okay, sorry about that, everybody online. Okay.
Okay, so anyway, so to answer the first question, which is sort of how we think about risk and the role of risk and how donors are conceptualizing risk. So basically, I make two arguments. One is that for practical purposes, you're right, there's programmatic risk and there's reputational risk, but they're afraid of both. And so I don't think that it's particularly maybe that important, and maybe future work try to disaggregate, but that there's a fear of risk that seems to be driving behavior. And I think one of the things that's useful when we actually look at it is we can compare this to both stated policy and previous empirical work. So for example, DFID, or when DFID existed, claimed we have a high risk appetite. For us, we want to be out there, we want to be doing stuff that makes things work and makes things better, et cetera, et cetera. And this is our sort of approach. Alternatively, a donor like USAID, shockingly, extremely risk averse, and they don't want to be taking risks. They want to be making sure that they're getting results for their money, even if maybe they're not getting the maximum possible results. So we've got different donors with different stated risk profiles. And it turns out they have the same level of risk aversion towards non-state justice that they don't have towards other policies. Therefore, I think there is something different, at least you could make an argument that there is something different going on with how non-state justice is being approached. And when you actually compare that to empirical work, so for example, Dan Honing in 2018 in his book argues in Navigation by Judgment, different donors are actually doing things differently with regards to risk as an empirical matter. So we have both stated policy and we have empirical policy about what they're doing in general. And non-state justice doesn't comport with that. So I think that there's something there. How much is there? Obviously, that's a future discussion, but I do think it is something it's not what we would expect just based on what donors are telling us for the existing literature. And then second, what do we make of these particular sort of hybrid-y kind of state, kind of not state, it's not state justice, but it's sponsored by the state. And it's a little bit a level of sort of analysis down from what I'm doing in this paper, but I will venture a guess on it. Basically, I think what you sort of tend to see with these types of institutions is that donors are much more open to them the more they feel like they're actually under their control or under their authority. So for example, donors, this is not based on the paper, but I'm just going to speculate, like a place like Rwanda, they had some interest in the processes because they're like, oh, this tends to be something which we think is broadly consistent with what we're sort of trying to achieve in a transitional justice context. Other places like Afghanistan, it's a little bit more fraught. And so I think donors in general are more willing to work with these institutions when they feel that they're not something which is being threatening or when the state's behaving in a way that they think is broadly consistent with their values. But I'm sure that even in the places where they work with them, they would take steps to not be too closely associated with anything that might not be. And I think you had a third question, but I'm sorry, I forgot.
It was related to that, mostly just about the extent to which their perception of risk and willingness to engage in these different ways with non-state justice cannot be disaggregated or disentangled from their thoughts about the legitimacy of the state itself there.
And so that's a good point. So basically what we tend to also to find is that donors have lots of views, at least what I found is donors have lots of views about states, but at the end of the day, they work with what exists. And so for example, the US in Afghanistan was always constantly telling the Afghan government or the previous Afghan government when it was the Islamic Republic, stop being so corrupt, right? But that didn't stop them from actually doing policy. And so this is one of the things that sort of is interesting, right? Is you sort of see places where, hey, we would really like to use non-state justice as a way around what's going on with the state or perceived legitimacy issues, perceived corruption issues, et cetera. But what it turns out is that basically if you want to play ball at any state, you kind of have to work with the state that's there independent of whether or not you think that it's legitimate. So they sort of legitimacy is a lived experience or legitimacy is empirical legitimacy. I apologize if that's the wrong manifestation of legitimacy is what it tends to really matter for these types of things.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Jesse. And Brian just had an observation online. He's babysitting his granddaughter, so I'm just going to paraphrase what he said there. But he mentioned that this seems to look quite different for strategies of Islamist insurgents, such as Shabab in Somalia and Taliban in Afghanistan, where justice seems have been an attractive part of what they offered. So I'm not sure, maybe it's worth reflecting, Jeff, on how these different groups are trying to use justice as a means to achieve legitimacy outside, beyond, like you said, the law.
Absolutely. That's a big part of the story here, and that's a big part of my story and sort of other work. So for example, I've written on sort of why US efforts to promote the rule of law in Afghanistan didn't sort of achieve what they were hoping to. And this had a lot to do with the fact that from a sort of justice sector competition standpoint, what the Afghan state backed by the international community was offering wasn't as, and I with all of the brackets and caveats and asterisks you want, as good functionally as Taliban justice. And this is a real reality. And the thing is also is that you have to compare these. It isn't just like, it's not like you're sending two petitions up to, the International Human Rights Council and they're going to win. What's better? It's just basically for actual people. The Taliban justice system, in some cases, was quick, predictable, less corrupt, and it wasn't actually actively involving rent seeking. And this was also combined with a heavy dollop of force and the threats of punishment of using the system. But the Afghan justice system was widely considered to be a worse system. And so I think it is really, really important to keep in mind that these are key parts of insurgency movements in a lot of places. So for example, if you go back and you read like classic insurgent theory, which I just submitted for my thesis years ago, Che Guevara is arguing like literally one of the first things you got to do is set up a justice system because it shows you're legitimate and it also makes people dependent upon you and also allows them to say, hey, you can't go work with those people over there. So I think it's a really important part of the story, and which shows why, if we think about what I'm looking at with the more extreme options, acceptance and repression, it only tends to be conflict zones where there's fundamental threats to the state, where international actors are willing to use those strategies at all. And they only tend to use those for limited periods of time, as long as they might actually work. And they think that there's a really, really compelling policy goal that justifies this. This happened in Afghanistan during the surge period, but then once the surge period was over and they're like, this isn't working, all of a sudden we're just going back to doing transformation, even though there's no indication it's actually working.
Well done. Thanks a lot. Yeah, Jamie, please.
Yeah, I actually wanted to follow along this line of thought. One is what you're talking about has been Pete Becky has talked about it in his article on institutional stickiness, where he's talking about like the exogenous versus endogenous factors that might explain why a policy might stick locally or not. So I that might be a helpful source for you. And he's also an affiliate of Workshop, which is cool. So. But I'm curious. So are you saying that people then in Afghanistan would prefer like the Taliban court system, and that's what gave it legitimacy over the Afghan court system because of the benefits they perceived?
I will do the full caveats of caveats, but a significant number
will be on YouTube later.
In a significant portion of the country felt that way. And I mean, it was also, these things are borne out empirically, right? After 20 years, up until the last survey that was run, by far the most corrupt part of the Afghan state, as perceived by the people, was the justice system. I mean, think about what a remarkable accomplishment that is in such a good field, right? It's extraordinarily corrupt and one of the most corrupt states in the world, and people are most upset about the justice sector. And so this sort of thing is, you hear the sort of stories of people being basically threatened with being charged with a crime that they didn't commit, a sort of rent extraction, lots of really, really bad, unpredictable stuff happening. And the Taliban's basic thing was, hey, we are going to have predictable laws and we're going to enforce the laws. And in our area, you're not going to have this sort of overarching corruption. Again, huge negative externalities that come with that. And it's only relative to a terrible state justice system that you make these comparative say that something is quote unquote better, but I heavily qualified yes.
Yeah, no, back to you, Bernie. Sure.
So every example you've given has been Afghanistan. So this seems to be a study about Afghanistan and not the broader world, even though I think that's not, when I first saw this, I think you were presenting a broader.
We can bring in your new book.
I realize you did a lot of work with Afghanistan, but if that's the model, I think that'd be a better way to frame the paper than that it's about Afghanistan and not the broader world.
It's a classic situation where when you're a fan of a sports team, you end up talking about the sports team. I did a lot of work in Afghanistan. I'm talking about that. So basically, what I've done in the actual paper is I've looked at big picture policy everywhere. In this particular paper, what's the official policy and what is the sort of underlying strategic rationale for it as a generalist matter? So basically, what is the general policy of Germany, the general policy of Japan, they don't have one, the general policy of the Netherlands, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I've done all of these different countries. And then in the one case, I do actually talk about the US particular investments in Afghanistan and policy in Afghanistan for the paper, because one, the amount of money that the US was putting into Afghanistan dwarfed the amount of money that every other state was putting in everywhere. And also that it generated sort of distinct policy. And Afghanistan was also always consistently the place where the US was putting those money. So I looked at that policy, sort of think about that. We can discuss whether that methodologically makes sense, but that was sort of the reason behind it. So it's a generalist policy approach, but I couldn't not talk. I felt I was distorting more in the paper by not looking at Afghanistan as one of the sort of manifestations than I would be if by including it, even if it's maybe a little bit discontinuous with that. So basically, I cover everything. And basically, what like if we're going to draw this on a map, like this is the world of policy over the recording time. these 9 states all here. And then I also look specifically at the US because they're spending so much in particular the back end.
But I guess I'll turn it around and say, but what the US relationship with Afghanistan is basically what everybody else has got with everywhere else. It's pretty much a consistent story across the globe.
Maybe it would be useful for me to say a little more what I actually did. And so basically, I looked at national security strategies, donor foreign aid strategies, basically any sort of issued statement about non-state rule of law strategies, these types of things, anything that was sort of big picture level for the country produced over time for all major donor agencies, as well as all sort of like foreign policy outlooking institutions. So like, your ministries of foreign affairs, ministries of defense, these types of things, as well as sort of high level, like something that's coming out of the executive office of the president of the US or the prime minister in the UK, sort of something like this. So I did all of this sort of general stuff. I didn't look into the specifics of like, here's a donor project in X, because I was trying to think about what's going on with high level policy, which is why I always stress I'm not making empirical claims about what specific programs are successful or not successful. I'm trying to understand what is the policy. So it's sort of like classic old school theory building. How do we sort of understand foreign policy towards non-state justice sort of conceptually? And then I also look specifically at those same types of things for Afghan policy. So I didn't go into every program done in Afghanistan, but I did look, were there joint statements on Afghanistan? What's the official USAID strategy on Afghanistan? Is Afghanistan mentioned in the national security strategy? This type of stuff. So I was trying to sort of catch a broad net, help us understand sort of policy towards non-state justice, wherever it existed, wherever it didn't exist.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, Eden, please.
I have a question. If you already checked, I don't remember the list of countries of donor countries that you were looking into, but my question is about the UK. If you looked at it and if it had some influence from its imperial past, because the UK, when it was an empire, I think it had even like an active policy of creating local separate institutions. And I know it, for example, from the case of Israel, when Israel was under the British mandate, you had the general state law, which was like the British mandate. But for issues of marriage and divorce, since you had the Jewish, Muslim, and Christian population who don't love each other too much, they basically gave it away to religious courts. So Jews getting married, you had the rabbinical courts, Muslim courts, and Christian courts, and this actually remained until this day. But it was a policy, I think, to be able to engage the population and give them some autonomy, and even like to different groups. So you give them a portion for what is very important to that population, and you take to yourself a contract law which is maybe less sensitive.
Yeah, so I did look at the UK. It was one of the sort of specific case studies, and what the UK did was, I guess, kind of interesting. And basically, they are one of the most thoughtful donors. They spend some of the most ink about like what we're trying to do and why we're trying to do it. And they had really, really sort of standard policies that were more or less consistent as everybody else. So at the beginning, they were interested in acknowledgement, i.e. we accept that non-state justice is important, something you have to work with. There was interest in transformation. We were interested in working with these systems, but making sure that they're also sort of respecting human rights. And then they would sort of have a lot of asides. They'd be like, and in some places we should consider maybe not working with them at all if they're blah, or while we recognize the dangers posed. And so they would have all these sort of like asides, but they can never sort of find an actual policy and ever make a sort of decision that went beyond just merely support for transformation, i.e. being consistent with human rights, and acknowledgement, saying it's important. So they're always kind of like a decade later, they're always kind of spinning around saying it's important. We really need to think this through. We really need to think this through. But there was never a point where they actually felt like they'd thought it through and had a policy. So I can't go into the sort of specific points about what their views on, the distinction of personal law versus public law in sort of particular states. But at the high level policy stuff I looked at, they were basically always transformation and acknowledgement.
Yeah, Jess, and then, I think Brian up there.
So I wanted to follow up because I'm having trouble wrapping my head around the unit of analysis. You talk about high level policy, which is great. So it's really the state level, but you have like 4 or 5 different US agencies who have actually slightly different perspectives here. And so that then makes me think, okay, how do we understand that? Or how can you help us think about that? And it then leads me to think about a larger question related to why some of these agencies may not have very good or strong policies in this area. And seemingly it depends on their potential level of engagement in a region where this is a particular issue, right? And so why would we expect a country whose aid agency isn't involved in a recipient country that faces state legitimacy issues or judicial institutional issues, we wouldn't necessarily expect them to have a well-developed, strong policy, both because maybe even just having that policy might be risky, especially if they are never required to engage with it. So I want to ask you sort of, if you were to turn this from theorizing into sort of more explicitly testing this, what would be the unit of analysis, and how would you think about it as a dyad with respect to the particular context that these agencies might be involved with?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's okay if I side back up?
Absolutely, yeah.
So the unit of analysis is the state, and sort of basically if you have an agency which is doing something, I no longer can go back, so I've defeated the purpose. Oh, there we go. Okay, so basically, I have in the actual paper, I've broken it down into the specific sorts of things. And so basically wanted to see, does any agency do anything that's, if the answer is yes, that sort of counts. So the unit of analysis is the state, any sort of state foreign policy apparatus from the Prime Minister's office to, the aid agency. And then what I was getting into the previous versions where people were like, oh, well, can you disaggregate further and tell us, is there something going on between the State Department versus USAID? Are we sort of getting anything different there? So I disaggregated further. Now all of a sudden I'm less parsimonious. I don't know. But that was the sort of thing. Basically, sort of the unit is the state. Now going specifically when we look at are we getting what we would expect from the particular agencies? The answer is actually kind of interesting, which is that even agencies, so for example, DOD, military organization, used to working in whatever we call kinetic environments, this type of stuff, instability, you would expect that they're a place that they would want to, they'd be open to working with agencies that exist as there are acceptance, or they're used to fighting people who are against their sort of strategic interests. But that wasn't actually what we found, or what I found. So I guess what I think was interesting about the individual unit level analysis is even places like, for example, the Netherlands, which said, hey, we focus on unstable and conflict-prone places. That's our sort of key strategic advantage. Only still transformation, acknowledgement, and a brief window of acceptance in conflict-prone settings. And then when they actually started to figure out what does it mean to have an acceptance policy, they got a little like, whoa. So then they just went back to being like a transformation and acceptance donor. And that sort of is the story. And the sort of broad trend line is all the donors that sort of came up to the edge of doing something more kind of got spooked and all sort of jumped back, which is how we sort of, I think what this paper kind of captures is sort of this moment of a bunch of different states thinking something's here with non-state justice, we need to do something with it. And then actually when they were confronted with the realities of what that might entail, they all kind of got a little bit spooked. So unit is the state. I look at the different agencies, see if there's any difference there. And it doesn't seem to actually change their behavior, even if they have a specific strategic focus or a particular regional focus. Australia focuses places with legal, high levels of legal pluralism. They're still doing the same thing in other places.
Brian, yeah, if you can hear us, please.
Yeah, okay, let me try. I guess my question, maybe I don't fully understand your categories of acceptance and transformation, but I'll point to an initiative from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, which is promoting voluntary guidelines on the governance of tenure, particularly land and fisheries, and their efforts to work on something for water, a lot of which starts with the first aspect of just paying more attention to the legal pluralism. What is going on? Which sets of institutions are, having an influence on access to resources and how disputes are handled and all that. And the voluntary guidelines, I mean, it's difficult and you can say they're trying to square the circle or something, but to me, it seems like it's an attempt at least to promote some kind of synthesis that with a kind of more fundamental acknowledgement of legal pluralism rather than, okay, this has to fit under, your classic, whatever you want to call it, Westphalian nation state, in charge of everything. So anyway, that's my comment. And in the chat, I put a link to these guidelines, which might be of interest because this is an attempt to offer guidance to states about how they can better understand what's going on in the case of natural resources. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And it's really, I think I'm using the categories sort of as ways to think about foreign policy strategies. And that would be maybe different than the way we would use similar words to describe maybe particular policy initiatives or what's happening in the ground in particular types of places. So when I say acceptance, I just mean you accept it as is, you're not trying to change it. When I say transformation, anything that you're basically saying, we want to work with you, but like you're a really nice person, but I wish you would do this, right? And so that's the sort of difference is, are you trying to change something? When it comes to those specific, when it comes to those specific categories that you're looking at, I think those are interesting. And I don't know to what extent full states, because I'm looking at states, would be involved with those types of initiatives. But I do think some of the similar logics might be at play, where I would guess in a lot of these sort of voluntary schemes, you want to sort of do certain types of things, but I bet it's very rare, but I don't know, because again, I haven't looked at your link yet, that they're going to just take things fully as is and say, this is how we're going through this. So it could in some ways mirror the logic of transformation, but again, I don't want to cross compare too much of stuff, but I think that's a good point.
Yeah, no, and just on that point, we could maybe take this into the kind of Ostromian direction, right? So there's, we're kind of dancing around a lot of issues, kind of nested governance structures, which is always kind of fun. So I'm remembering one paper we did a few years ago that looked at legal pluralism directly, kind of on Brian's point around property rights. And we looked at kind of Indonesia, South Africa, US, and a couple of other examples. And there's just a tremendous range, right, of how these different groups are thinking about even just common property rights. And in particular, the kind of ideas around polycentricity that the workshop's kind of known for can be useful in kind of considering some frameworks. And I'm looking at your framework, like immediately it brought to mind some, we'll talk more about this over the next month, Jeff, but some more intersections there that kind of Jamie was alluding to a few minutes ago as well. So I'm wondering, maybe you could tell us a little more about how this fits into your overall, research agenda and book project, because you might already be thinking about, a lot of this stuff already. So we don't take it in a totally different direction, but to the extent that any of us complementary, we want to make sure to raise it.
That's really good. And so this is sort of the next phase 2 or phase 2.5 of sort of my research project. So my research project, I think, it started at least, is much more sort of on these sort of classic themes that are really big at the workshop, which is conceptualizing different types of legal pluralism, conceptualizing different types of order, thinking about how the state interacts with different manifestations of legal pluralism and what we can sort of, how we should think about them and different strategies that may exist. And then a lot more sort of empirical work, places like Afghanistan and a lot of work in Timor-Leste. So my first sort of book project, which has taken 6+ years, but is finally getting there, was sort of comparing strategies for approaching the rule of law, and particularly how legal pluralism was taken into account or not taken into account in different states, and what we might be able to learn from that. And so this is sort of the next generation of research where I'm looking at foreign policy. And so this paper is about foreign policy strategies, but it also sort of dovetails with other work that I've done, which is actually looking at more sort of empirical work. So for example, one of my areas of interest was paralegal aid, right? Paralegals are one of these things that for whatever reason, they have an incredible, they've been really, really good at sort of promoting themselves as these paralegals are amazing and they can sort of navigate spaces and they can work in all the more difficult places. They can help non-state justice, respect human rights. We can also make sure everything sort of gets into state courts. And what I found is that actually is kind of the case, but not really. And actually power dynamics are really, really important. Human rights, they may not have this, paralegals' notions of human rights norms may not be the same as the international donors that are funding them. Issues about human resources, just getting people that sort of are going to be volunteer, all these sorts of issues. So I've done a lot of sort of empirical work and the sort of specifics of initiatives, and this project is sort of trying to take a step back and sort of think about policy. So I think this project maybe is less within sort of core fit of what is being done here, but I think it sort of comes from a project which is about, I think, the core.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, some of our original stuff was looking at laka adalats, like these village courts, in India, and how they were actually written in over time to the Indian, constitution. I haven't been following it. Has just given your focus on Afghanistan, have there been any like official pronouncements made yet about how they're going to be dealing with the legal system in Afghanistan? Or the Taliban courts now basically that's it, or are they still trying to repurpose some of the existing judicial structure? And many countries came out and said we're still going to provide some kind of legal aid here. Is that I understand it's pretty much all been cut at this point? Or
yeah, I mean, so Taliban very rarely sort of has these big picture. Here's our 10-year plan for modernized judiciary.
Yeah, right.
What they've sort of done, and sort of this is actually broadly consistent with what was the previous regime's policy, was Taliban justice, but also we're okay with tribal justice, provided that it's consistent with Taliban's vision of tribal justice. So, they're trying to change non-state justice as well, right? And I guess now that the state would be consistent with my sort of theory. So, so I would say that you sort of, these dynamics, once you become the state, even if you were once not the state, you then start having a lot of these sort of same types of dynamics about how exactly you're going and you're interacting with non-state justice. Sorry, did you have a question?
Sure.
Is that okay?
No, please, Jamie. Yeah.
Okay, great. So what I see in your paper is sort of this tacit assumption that governments recognize the value of legal institutions. Like I'm seeing institutions all over the things that you're talking about, even though you haven't really talked about the notion of institutions. So I don't know if that's the direction you want to take your paper in or not, but I definitely see that through your work, which is cool. We talked about the idea of legal, as like this, there was a reference to legal system as being competitive. And in some cases it is, but in some cases it's not so much either. And I think that's also an interesting thing to think about as well, because I forget which country it is. There's like this small little, like, it wasn't even a country. It was like this region in Europe for like 100 years. It had its own, it was like an agreed upon protected area. And so the people in the area could actually had 3 different countries that they could go to for legal options. So they could choose. And most of us don't have that element of choice. Right?
If you move to Timor-Leste, you'll be able to.
Which is fascinating that we have like we don't get to choose between state options, let me put it that way. So I think that that's fascinating, this idea of non-states is providing options for people too. So I'm just,
I think all the institutional stuff is really, really important. And it's sort of also like when we're trying to move into the realm of, what's going on empirically on the ground, you can't escape it. What I do with the rule of law, and why I'm not talking specifically about institutions too much in this paper, is basically donors say, we support the rule of law. It's a major foreign policy objective. So that's the sort of the entry point there. I'm saying, okay, well, what does that mean? Are you focusing on state justice institutions? Are you focusing on non-state justice institutions? That type of stuff. And then sort of on your second point, that's one of the sort of things that I've been arguing about for quite a while, is that we need to conceptualize legal pluralism in a wide range of different forms. And I personally argue people can have different, everyone's got a typology. My typology is you got to think about it ranging from combative, i.e. state, non-state are actually trying to destroy each other. Competitive, they have real autonomy in the non-state justice sector, but they're not actually trying to take the mantle of the state itself. So there may be some tensions there, but they're not trying to become the state. Cooperative is what I argue exists in a place like Timor-Leste, where there's still real autonomy, but they support the overarching project. They're not trying to topple the state, but they're not necessarily going to have the same view about human rights or women's rights or these types of things. And then what I have in a place like the US be something like complementary, where you may have a non-state justice system, and indeed every place does have a non-state justice system, but it exists at the pleasure of the state, and the state's able to regulate it and get rid of it. So you can have an arbitration agreement, as I mentioned, but the state can decide we're not going to enforce that arbitration agreement, where there's going to be limits on what you can actually opt out of within the context of state law.
So thinking about, right, so legal institutions are a form of public good, right? To really come full circle. Which then, in some ways, given the typology that you just laid out, it kind of requires that we think a little bit about the conditions under which states would either subcontract or cede the production or provision of those.
Disagree. No, I mean, that's the fundamental difference, is that I think we can't assume state capacity.
No, you don't need to assume. One need not assume state capacity. In fact, for me, in sort of similar work along these lines, right, I think about the fact that state capacity, everybody has limits on state capacity, right? There's no state that has complete uniform capacity across issue domains and across space, right? That means all states must make decisions about how they allocate resources for the provision of some goods, not others, right? And that means even strong states might cede provision of goods for various reasons. And so I was not going to go very far in that direction. I was mostly going to suggest that it seems like there could be some interesting synergies with Thomas Rissa and Tanya Borzel's work in this regard, right? Because a lot of what they have been thinking about, maybe not, maybe less so now, but in governance without a state and a few other areas, is this idea of like, okay, what not only what does this mean for the legitimacy of both of these actors, but like under what conditions do we actually see these non-state actors? And in my case, I think a lot about firms doing a bunch of things, but we could think about NGOs or ethnic groups or whoever this other provider is of that group. And so I'm thinking about sort of zooming out, like you suggested your lens has been for policy, and I think it's an important and valid one. I'm wondering if an offshoot of the paper could be to think more broadly about non-state provision of judicial systems in this context, and the conditions and sets of incentives for either complementary, full succession, competition, et cetera, these kinds of like what rate, why would states allow this or not allow this, even if they have the capacity to provide themselves?
Yeah. No, I think those are really, really fascinating questions, and I've engaged with some of that work, but it's definitely an area where I need to do even more sort of deep delving into. And I think that's something that I'm trying to think about myself, and sort of thinking about how do legally sort of pluralist transformations occur, what's sort of conducive, and sort of what are, obviously there's sort of an analytic clarity that may come from sort of focusing on the state versus non-state, but that comes at the sort of cost of the actual reality is much more complicated, and sort of firms are doing things, and sort of these weird NGO actors are doing stuff as well. So I think that's a sort of ongoing area of great interest to me.
Oh, for sure. I think Angie, and then Jamie.
Can I ask a real basic question? Whose theory do you rely upon to define rule of law? It seems almost essential, and I wonder how many of these NGOs are using the common buzzword rule of law, get in on the ground and realize they don't have a clue what rule of law actually means, and haven't grappled with Bingham and fill in the blank.
I'll take that and I'll double it, and I'll say most of them probably will have issues with what exactly human rights are as well.
Yeah, right. Well, that's what caused me more than a pause. First of all, I'm happy to connect you with my friends at Bickle if you aren't. But this is something that I've had to grapple with about a zillion different times, and even coming up with a definition of rule of law is brutally evil, especially amongst the Brits, quite frankly. So that one where you're at. But I don't think I disagree. I think I disagree with your definitions, and it's in footnote number 1. And so the only reason I point that out is because that's an easy way for me to ignore your paper,
Mhm.
is when you don't say, I'm relying upon the definition that Lord Bingham brings forward as to the rule of law, which, and he's sort of the hallmark, but doesn't, where you are at least, but doesn't have to be. But these verbs that you're using, I don't agree with. And I don't think he would either. And I wonder how much that changes your conversation, though, when you realize that the Canadians, the Americans, and Japan are walking in with our conceptualization of rule of law. And Bingham struggles with human rights within the context of rule of law. And so I wonder if the Netherlands and, some of the non-traditional common law influenced countries, come to a different definition, and that's some of the tension that you're seeing. And I just throw it out there, and you're nodding, so I think you must sort of at least take that issue on.
Not the first person who's ever raised issues about.
I'm going with you're in the UK, so Bingham's come up 1,000 times, because I did my PhD over there, and they're like, what about Lord Bingham? And I'm like, who the hell are you talking about? You're American talking about rule of law, and I'm like, yeah, the NGOs, it's a buzz phrase we pick up.
Yeah.
And so all I'm suggesting, I guess, is that, you throw in here somewhere whose definition of rule of law you're embracing.
Yeah, and this is I have to say this is also a funny thing because I actually did my law degree in the States, so I
Right. We can learn this. And they could have written, and they're like, rule of law fundamental. We teach it in every class. And I'm like, that's sort of like a buzz phrase at the UN and stuff. Yeah.
This is I have to say this is the victim of the peer review process.
Yeah.
And so basically I started out having a very robust definition. We're talking thick
And then they
thin,
proved it
we're
in
talking
real
about
life.
all this sort of
Yeah.
stuff, and here's why I've got this sort of individual sort of the choice that I've made. And I getting it staying under 12 has just been
Yeah.
sort of that's sort of
Fair
the
enough.
things that are there.
Yeah.
And so for me, basically, I'll give you my answer on rule of law, and I'll tell
Yeah.
you how I tried to bracket in the paper, and you can
Sure.
agree or disagree. But basically, rule of law is a contested term. All of these states say that they're doing it. Here's the proof. Let's see, what does that mean when you're putting a state institution versus a non-state institution? And that's sort of all I'm sort of saying. You say you're doing the rule of law. What does that mean, state versus non-state policy? Even if what that means to you is different, I can still look at what you're doing with a non-state justice institution. Second, on a personal level, I mean, I guess I'm a thin person, but you need to have a commitment to the state to following the rule of law, and that sort of for me is the big thing, because
State being held
if
accountable.
you don't have the state that's willing to be bound by its own law and takes the law seriously, you don't have the rule of law. I also believe as an empirical matter, it's really difficult to disaggregate it from democratic governance. So those are sort of my big two things. I think that once you start getting into the too thick of the rule of law conceptualizations, you start just ending up with, here's my policy program. It's also, this is what rule of law is. And so even though I think those things are really, really important, for me, it's basically, do we have a law that applies to everybody, including the highest levels of people? And are they themselves bound to it? Or if they're not bound to it, is there sort of mechanisms to make them have to be bound to it, even when they don't want to be? But
I'm smiling because the US is foul.
and I mean, you can raise some really serious issues about the US and indeed the entire world. And you can also raise papers, and I sort of hint about it in conclusion, how serious the efforts to promote the rule of law writ large really are.
Mhm.
Maybe that's in the paper.
Yeah. Big focus of the administration. Do you have a quick one, Jamie, before we
Yeah.
finish off, or do you want? Yeah.
Yeah, no, just the idea, it was on the idea of rule of law, so this is perfect, yeah. But the idea, so there is this assumption, like just pointed out that rule of law is like a public good given by the state. I don't think that's a public choice assumption. I think it assumes that rule of law is an institution that supports the public goods arena. I don't think, especially if you read Vincent's, it's very much of the idea that citizenship flows from people, not state. And so that might be an interesting question to think about too. And that brings
They're all really,
up
really,
ideas.
and they're all very relevant.
I love it. Well, any final reflective thoughts, Jeff, before we have to conclude?
I just want to say thanks. This is why I really miss talking to people in real life, and I've also really that we're here online as well. So thanks for the questions, but it was really, really thought-provoking and worthwhile. So thanks for the time.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jeff. And we got through it without a slap, so and Jeff will be here all month. We'll arrange some more meetings, so this has been lovely. Thanks, everybody, for joining it. We'll look forward to Jamie's research series on Wednesday.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Do you know the people?